Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Today's video is going to be the third part in my series about the evolution of Portuguese as a language. If you missed the first two parts, I would highly recommend that you watch them. You can find them in the eye above or directly on my channel, and I also happen to have a bunch of other videos about Portuguese and linguistics. That being said, this video is going to be about the evolution of Brazilian Portuguese. I'm actually going to split this section of this series up into at least two videos because there is a lot to cover, and I would like to have enough time to talk about each thing in a little bit of detail. So in this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the general aspects of the evolution of Brazilian Portuguese. How did Brazilian Portuguese come about? What are the things that influenced it? And what the most significant grammatical changes that have happened are. Brazilian Portuguese starts naturally with the establishment of the Brazilian colonies by the Portuguese. And the first stable, self-sustaining colonies in Brazil took root in the early 1500s. This initial period of colonization in Brazil is marked by heavy contact with indigenous tribes that were the original inhabitants of the coastal areas that the Portuguese went on to settle. From a linguistic standpoint, this is a very relevant piece of information. However, before we get into that, we should talk a little bit about how Brazilian Portuguese diverged from the European standard of speaking. For that, it's good to remember that languages change and grow apart when they are separated from one another. The further the distance and less contact between two languages, the more different they are likely to be. I'm saying this in a context of related languages. The Romance languages themselves arise because of these differences. Now that is a big simplification, but it suffices to say that an ocean of distance would lead to Brazilian Portuguese being different almost from the very start when compared with the continental European language. There are a number of reasons for this, and the contact with the indigenous tribes is one of the most important ones. As the Portuguese colonists were settling that land, they came across new things such as new plants and new animals and a whole bunch of other new things that they were discovering for the first time. Naturally, these things did not have words that existed in the Portuguese language. So from just a lexical standpoint, Brazilian Portuguese already had been absorbing a lot of indigenous words so that it could describe the world in which it found itself. Many of those words would also indeed make it into Portuguese more generally. But the people who were being born and raised in the colonies also did not have that much contact with the native-born Europeans who brought the language with them. Indeed, up until a decree in the late 1700s by Marquês de Pombal that Portuguese was to be the only language used in Portugal and its colonies, a Creole language was in fact the popular language used in the Brazilian colonies. Due to the colonists' contact with local indigenous tribes and the necessity to communicate with them, a Creole language based on Portuguese grammar and indigenous words had emerged and was the language that the lower or common classes spoke amongst themselves. It is widely documented that administrative officials who would go to the Brazilian colonies would need translators in order to speak with local people. That doesn't mean that they stopped being Portuguese colonizers or that they stopped having Portuguese language influence. It just means that the linguistic reality of that time was that Portuguese was relegated mostly to an administrative position and the language of the higher classes. Yet despite that, we have knowledge that the Portuguese spoken by Brazilian colonists began to diverge starting in around the 1600s. The primary way in which we can tell that Portuguese began to split in the 16 and 1700s is by way of phonetics. However, I am going to get into Brazilian phonetics in another video. In this video, we're going to be focusing on more general aspects and a little bit of grammar. You might have heard about the idea that Brazilian Portuguese itself is a Creole language. This is a theory that is also applied to languages like English, which have undergone significant influence from other outside languages. From an academic standpoint, there is no consensus as to whether Brazilian Portuguese or English itself should be considered as a pure Creole language. Certainly, languages like Brazilian Portuguese and English have undergone some level of Creolization due to the influences that they have had. However, to classify them outright as Creole languages neither has a consistent academic base of support for it, nor is it a particularly interesting or relevant question to the kind of videos that I'm making about Portuguese. With that being said, Brazilian Portuguese has had a lot of influences from outside languages that European Portuguese has not necessarily had. In the early periods of colonization of Brazil, the indigenous languages exerted a great influence on the Portuguese spoken. The most notable contribution to Brazilian Portuguese by the indigenous languages was indeed indeed the lexical aspect. There are, quite simply, a lot of words with indigenous language origins in Brazil. It is also hypothesized that indigenous languages contributed to local accents in various regions in Brazil. However, we will explore that in the next video. But Brazilian Portuguese didn't stop getting influenced there because the history of Brazil is one of immigration up until the 20th century. There were many significant waves of immigration to Brazil, as happened throughout the Americas. And those waves of immigration would have a similar influence and impact on Brazilian Portuguese that the indigenous languages themselves did. The major contributions of the European languages that arrived to Brazilian shores with the mass immigration of Germans and Italians and other European ethnic groups to Brazil would be in the lexical department. Different words for describing the same thing throughout Brazil can often be traced back to which immigrant groups settled in which places. This is also true of the waves of immigration from places like Lebanon and Japan. Brazil has the largest population of Japanese-descended people outside of Japan, and that is reflected in some part in the words that Brazilian speakers use to describe things that are of Japanese origin. The words for things like soy sauce are different in Brazil and Portugal. It is also impossible to forget the influence of West African languages on Brazilian Portuguese. The history of colonization in the Americas is one marked by slavery and the forced removal by European powers of West African people to the new continents. The slaves who were brought to the Americas did not simply forget the languages that they had brought with them, and indeed in Brazil they continued to leave a linguistic mark well throughout the entire period of slavery that happened in that country. It is certain that African languages contributed highly to the lexicon of Portuguese in general, but especially to Brazilian Portuguese, and in some places it is also true that African languages contributed to the phonetic structure of local accents. Yet despite all of this foreign linguistic influence on Brazilian Portuguese, there is no consensus that the changes that have happened to Brazilian grammar are the direct result of any one specific linguistic influence. What we can deduce from that is that the grammatical changes that happened in Brazil over time were the natural result of the way in which the people being born and raised in Brazil were using the Portuguese language. The more widespread adoption of the Portuguese language as the main language of use in Brazil starting in the 1800s explains in large part why the greatest divergences between Brazilian and European Portuguese started in the second half of the 1800s. Many of the most distinctive ways in which Brazilians speak and use grammar were fully consolidated by the mid-20th century. Some of those changes have also sped up in the last 50 years or so. However, the landscape of linguistic usage in Brazilian Portuguese is also marked by another factor. That factor is class structure in Brazilian society. Colonial Brazil was a very strictly hierarchical society. Each group occupied a certain position in a rigid hierarchy, and there was not very much movement between them. That hierarchical rigidity was reflected in the way in which the Portuguese language was used, and continues to be reflected in some part in the way that Portuguese is used in general to this day. However, that also had an influence on things like the use of the prestige form of Portuguese, or the educated normative use of Portuguese. To this day, Brazilians who are in higher classes and therefore have had higher access to education are more likely to speak in a more normative sort of Portuguese. That doesn't preclude them from speaking with many of the grammatical changes that have occurred in Brazilian Portuguese. However, it simply means that through their education in the Portuguese language, they have acquired usage of normative forms of grammar. It is true in Brazilian Portuguese, as well as in most languages generally, that the innovation in things like grammar has stemmed from the way that the lower classes speak, later on being adopted more generally. The most notable changes to Brazilian grammar have occurred in a couple of different areas. Single-handedly, the most significant change to Brazilian grammar is in its syntax. When we talk about Brazilian syntax and the changes to it, we're talking about the placement and usage of pronouns. Brazilian has innovated a different way of analyzing and assessing pronoun use in Portuguese. Whereas European Portuguese, along with most other Romance languages with little exception, is a pro-drop language, or a language that can omit the subject pronoun, in Brazilian Portuguese the subject pronoun has become all but mandatory, and this is due to something that I talked a little bit about in my video about the word você and forms of treatment in Portuguese. Because of the ambiguity created by the use of third-person conjugations for second-person forms of address in Brazil, major shifts in the usage of pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese began to happen. This is due to no longer being able to deduce from the verb conjugation who is performing the action of the verb. This ultimately means that in Brazilian Portuguese you must use the subject pronouns, because otherwise otherwise there could be ambiguity. But Brazilian Portuguese didn't stop there with the pronouns. The other pronouns that are in use in the Portuguese language also had some shifts in Brazilian Portuguese. The use of weak pronouns like u, a, us, as, that refer to other things in a phrase began to become slowly eliminated from casual Brazilian speech. And in their place, tonic or full pronouns began to be used. It's why we have constructions like vil instead of viu in Brazilian Portuguese. This is also connected to why Brazilian Portuguese has come to favor português. Essentially, from a grammatical perspective, Brazilian Portuguese has taken the analysis of phrasal structure and determined that pronouns be placed in front of the most important verbal element in a phrase. This is a very simple explanation for how these changes occurred, and if you would like me to explain this in greater detail in a future video, I would be happy to do so. Just leave me a comment down below. Suffice it to say, because of all of the shifting that occurred in Brazilian Portuguese with regard to pronouns, português became the natural position of the pronoun. This is in contrast to the way that European Portuguese analyzes pronouns, which prefers enclês. But there is at least one other area in which Brazilian Portuguese grammar has innovated certain changes. I'm talking about verbal agreement, especially in number. What I'm talking about is the various ways in which Brazilian speakers will often reduce the usage of the plural in a phrase. This is a systematic change that has happened in Brazilian Portuguese among the lesser educated classes, which can be seen in the use of phrases like os menino or the use of the third person conjugation for pretty much all people except for the first person. That's how we get ele está or nós está, which is a legitimate way that some Brazilian speakers who have had lesser access to formal education speak, and it is indeed a more generally popular colloquial way of talking in Brazil. You will often jokingly see perfectly educated people in Brazil saying things like nós está. When we're talking about these things, it is also important to highlight the fact that from a linguistic standpoint, there is no such thing as bad language. So when we're talking about these non-normative ways that people are speaking, they are from a linguistic standpoint speaking in perfectly legitimate manners. It just so happens that many of these grammatical innovations don't sit perfectly well with the educated grammatical norm. As I mentioned previously, therefore, linguistic usage in Brazil is also highly conditional to the social class of the person speaking. However, that also applies to the other end of the spectrum as well. Many educated Brazilian speakers will often overcorrect in their attempt to emulate the norm of Portuguese. Normative Portuguese in an international sense is mostly based on the European standard of speaking. Despite that, the syntactical changes that have happened in Brazilian Portuguese still remain, and so those educated speakers are still approaching the formation of phrases and sentences in a fundamentally different way than their European counterparts. In this sense, it is not uncommon to see a seemingly unnatural usage of the weaker pronouns and enclês among educated Brazilian speakers. This, in most cases, is derived from a simple matter of overcorrection. But I dare say that is quite a lot of information for one video already. I will be talking a little bit more about Brazilian phonetics and other aspects of Brazilian Portuguese in my next video of this series, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make videos about food, culture, and especially the Portuguese language. You can find those videos directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.